everyone, my name is Shreya Korlipara, and my presentation is on mental health weeks and the industrial worker. Let's just jump right into the problem. So, since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, rates of industrial worker burnout in large brand name corporations has been significantly increasing, especially for remote workers. As you can see by this graph on the screen by Michelle Fox in a 2021 news article, 69% of industrial workers who are working from home remotely experience severe mental health burnout. Unfortunately, worker burnout can cause emotions such as stress and anxiety to build up within these workers. As cited in a 2021 article by Catherine Vassell, these workers who are working longer hours and are feeling burnt out feel, quote, perpetually behind. Unfortunately, the mechanisms that these workers are utilizing in order to cope with their issues like burnout and stress are very ineffective, as they only bring them temporary gratification rather than long-term permanent happiness. This led me to the research question, as you can see is displayed on my screen. The roadmap of my argument will be as follows. First, I will be discussing the psychological effects of mental health burnout overall and how they happen in the first place. Next, I will be talking about a better long-term solution to this issue rather than the temporary gratification solutions that these workers are utilizing to deal with their stress. And finally, I will be discussing the economic benefits of implementing this long-term solution of mental health weeks. So first, let's talk about the psychological detriments of mental health burnout and why this happens in the first place. So why does worker burnout happen? Well, according to a 2020 news article by Rory Moorer, it is very difficult for workers to set boundaries for themselves in a home environment. Say, from the comfort of your own bedroom, it would be very difficult for you to set a very definite start and end time to your work. This connects back to the argument presented by Catherine Vassell, which stated that workers feel perpetually behind. The reasoning why these workers are feeling perpetually behind is because it is difficult for them to set boundaries and truly disconnect from their work. And Moore argues that this causes workers to have to work longer hours as a whole. Unfortunately, workers working longer hours pushes them into a negative cycle of burnout, which causes severe mental health issues, as illustrated in a peer-reviewed journal article published in 2020 by Seung-Jin Park and his team, which stated that longer working hours bring upon stress, depression, and suicidal ideation, all of which are severe psychological issues that impair the mental health of workers as a whole. And unfortunately, as I had stated beforehand, the coping mechanisms that these workers are utilizing in order to deal with their issues causes them to only experience temporary gratification and not effectively deal with their burnout. And one of the mechanisms that these workers are utilizing to deal with their issues is the consumption of alcohol. As found by Mariana Virtanen and her team in 2015, workers who are working longer hours are 11.7% more likely to use alcohol riskily. And unfortunately, this only brings them temporary gratification, as we will observe in the next few slides. I propose a better solution to this, which is mental health weeks, and I will now explain why mental health weeks will provide a more sustainable solution than the consumption of alcohol or any other materialistic means that these workers are utilizing right now to achieve pure happiness. As argued in a nonfiction book called The Book of Joy, written by the Dalai Lama, as well as Douglas Abrams and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, sensory pleasures only bring an individual temporary happiness. Sensory pleasures are examples like using retail therapy and shopping in order to allow an individual to feel happier. Another example of a sensory pleasure is, as I had stated before, alcohol. Sensory pleasures can only bring an individual temporary happiness because the Dalai Lama argues that sensory pleasures, after an individual engages with them multiple times, will soon become numb to their effects, which will not give them any gratification. Likewise, as Virtanen and her team found, workers are utilizing alcohol to deal with their issues more. And unfortunately, because alcohol is a sensory pleasure, it will not bring individuals more joy than a few hours of intoxication. Thus, I argue that the implementation of mental health weeks will truly allow workers to achieve longer-term happiness. This is because the Dalai Lama also argues that what brings individuals permanent joy and overall happiness is through forming connections with other people, because it allows them to experience feelings like compassion and empathy. And providing mental health weeks for workers will allow them to go out and find time to make connections with people, and they will be able to experience emotions like compassion and empathy, which will provide them more permanent joy than the coping mechanism of the consumption of alcohol that they are utilizing right now to deal with their issues as a whole. Longer-term happiness can also bring economical benefits to workers and employers as a whole. As you can see on the screen, a study conducted by Bullet and his team in 2015 essentially found that happier workers are 13% more productive. Therefore, the economic benefits to companies rely upon the psychological benefits that could be brought upon, as stated by the Dalai Lama, by the implementation of mental health weeks, because it allows them to experience emotions such as compassion, which are responsible for bringing workers happier lives. As a whole, happier workers are net beneficial to companies because it brings them more revenue. As Bullet's team also illustrates that the happier workers were able to make more calls per hour, which directly correlated with a higher amount of sales that a certain product had. Therefore, not only will the implementation of mental health weeks be beneficial to the psychology of workers by allowing them to become more happy and allow them to have a more effective means of coping with burnout, but also will be beneficial to companies as a whole as their revenue will increase. Unfortunately, with every solution comes limitations, and this one is no exception. Nike, which has recently instituted a mental health week, has come under criticism by Joel Mitchell, who is a head of People Diagnostics, or a company that deals with health and productivity as a whole. She scrutinized Nike for its mental health week because she stated that workers essentially would return to the same brutal conditions as they had before the implementation of the mental health week, which would not allow them to experience joy or be able to deal with the issues that they face, like burnout, any better than they had before. And Mitchell does have a valid point here, because providing workers with only 1 week off would not allow them enough time to form connections with other people and experience emotions such as compassion and joy. And therefore, because of this very short time frame, they may not be able to utilize the happiness that they gain from these experiences to deal with issues such as burnout. That is why I propose that in addition to allowing workers to have a mental health week and time off to interact with other people, it is also important to institute it within the workplace itself with healthy workplace practices. An example of this is illustrated in a peer-reviewed journal article by Wu and her team, which found that implementing a healthy workspace and allowing workers a space to interact with those around them truly allowed them to be able to be happier in their workplace, which would allow the effects of a mental health week to continue even after the break time is over. Therefore, I conclude that by providing workers with a mental health week, we will be able to bring both economic benefits to a company and psychological benefits to a worker, which as a net benefit will allow workers to achieve true happiness as a whole. Even if these workers are not able to experience happiness after the 1 week time frame, they will be able to experience it if healthy workplace practices are implemented in addition to these mental health weeks. Here are my works cited, and thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you for your presentation today. I have a couple of questions for you. The first question, did your research go in a different direction than you originally expected?
Yes, actually, my research did go in a different direction than I had originally expected. So originally, what I had intended to do with my research was same topic. I wanted to explore the effects of workers and mental health weeks as a whole. However, I wanted to observe in general what the effects of mental health weeks were on all workers of all types of demographics, and both in person and remote. However, I soon came to realize, after I had found the evidence that I had stated in the beginning of my presentation by Michelle Fox, that remote workers were significantly more affected by mental health burnout due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is why a lot of my research is focused very specifically on remote workers specifically, rather than beforehand when I wanted to focus on just industrial workers in general.
Thank you. My other question, what are the implications of your findings to your community?
Yeah, so because of the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously last year and this year we had gone completely virtual. And I personally believe that since a lot of us are still working remotely, such as I believe companies like Kaiser Permanente and VMware are still having their industrial workers work remotely, I believe that in this case, my findings will be beneficial to my community, because industrial workers like those of those companies that are working remotely still will be able to benefit from my research, as they will be able to institute healthy workplace practices that will allow their workers to be more productive and have a better mental health as a whole, and also be able to allow their workers to thrive psychologically and achieve longer-term happiness, and be able to provide a better coping mechanism than those workers in these companies that are still working remotely, to be able to achieve longer-term happiness than the coping mechanisms that they're using currently.